Hi everyone, it's Celine from Blue Cowlet Patterns, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the adjustable zipper foot that comes in the HD leather kit and use this foot to add piping to your bag. So for the video, I'm actually sewing up one of my free patterns from my website. It's the Lilac Mini Messenger bag, and it has piping along the outer edges of the flap, and it also has piping along the outer seam of the exterior of the bag. It's for the most part, it is the same technique that you're using. There's just a slight difference when you're sewing piping into the side seam of a bag. It's not complicated. I'm going to explain that difference a little bit later on. But to start, we're going to add piping to the flap of our bag. So this is the front of the flap. And I'm going to be using this Wrights brand bias tape maxi piping. And I really like this brand because I don't like a huge piping cord. I like it to be fairly small and subtle. And I like it also because the tape portion of the piping is exactly 3/8 of an inch wide, which is the typical seam allowance I use for the construction of the bags in all of my patterns. So we're going to be using pre-made piping. I'm not making my own. And we're going to add I'm going to install the adjustable zipper foot to the HD9, which is what I'm going to be using. And I'll show you how we're going to use this foot to sew the piping to the flap. I've attached the adjustable zipper foot to the machine, and you'll notice that I can adjust the section, the foot. I can adjust its position so it's either to the left of the needle or to the right of the needle. And in this, when you're attaching piping, you want this to be on the right-hand side of the needle. So you can adjust the position by loosening the screw and choosing your ideal position for the foot, and then tightening the screw when you're happy with its position. I'm now going to start basting my piping to the outside edge of my flap. Leave the piping sticking out a little bit at the top, about 1/2 inch. And then you want to place the raw edge of the tape portion of the piping so that it is lined up with the outside edge of the flap. Use a basting stitch length. I'm using a stitch length of 5 on the HD9. And when you're basting, use 1/4 inch seam allowance from this edge. Now, as I'm approaching the rounded bottom edge of my flap, I'm going to clip into the tape portion of my piping about 1/4 inch. This will help it work its way around the curve nice and smoothly. Again, I'm approaching a curved edge. I just want to make sure that I clip into that seam allowance a tiny bit to help it go around the curve nicely. Now you'll note that I used a contrasting thread color. This will help me in the next step when I sew the two flap layers together. I'm going to sew with the basting stitching from my piping facing upwards so that when I'm sewing the two flap pieces together, I can make sure that I'm sewing inside that basting stitch. Now, when you're adding piping to the body of a bag, you don't want to start the piping all the way at the top like you did for the flap. If you add the piping all the way into the top here, when you're assembling the bag, you're going to find it very bulky here at the top corners, especially with the Lilac Messenger bag. I'm attaching a strap here, so you want to avoid having that piping all the way in the top seam. So what I do is I measure about 1/2 inch down from that top corner, and then I have my piping like this, sticking out the side of the bag. I'm just going to take my pin, which was marking my 1/2 inch mark, and then I just lift up the foot. You can even do a little bit of clipping here in the tape portion just to help you rotate, and then have the raw edge of the piping again lined up with the raw edge of the outside of your bag. And these steps are exactly the same as for the flap. You baste with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you make sure that you clip into the tape portion of the piping when you get to the bottom corners of the bag. So I have the corner here. I'm going to just clip into this portion. And now again, when we reach the opposite corner, we're going to want to do the same thing and angle out the piping 1/2 inch from that corner. Now, the next step is to attach our two flap pieces together. So the front of the flap and the back of the flap, and we're going to clip those together, right sides together. And we have that piping sandwiched in between. Now, when we're sewing the two flap pieces together, you're going to have to remember to put your stitch length to a regular stitch length because we're actually sewing these together. We're not just basting them together. You're going to turn this over because you want to see the basting stitches from the piping. You want that facing up so that you can make sure that you're sewing inside that line of basting stitches. Now I'm going to use the zipper foot again. However, normally I would just go ahead and use my regular foot because I feel that it gives me a bit more control. However, that depends on the size of the cording in your piping. Mine is very thin, so I can use a regular foot. But if you prefer a thicker cording inside your piping, then you're going to have to continue this part using your adjustable zipper foot. So I'm using a regular stitch length of 3. I'm keeping my needle in the down position. And while I'm sewing, I'm using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure that I'm sewing inside those basting stitches. Now, if you're also using the HD9, if you want to know what 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is, It's the line right here with the number 10. Now, before you trim your seam allowance or anything, we're actually going to check to see if we did a good job with the piping and if we sewed close enough to the cording of the piping. So you can go ahead and flip your flap, or if you're sewing at the body of your bag, you want to just turn your bag right side out. And then you want to just go along and examine the piping just to make sure that you've sewn close enough to the cording. So actually did a great job. Now, if you find that there's a section where either you've sewn too close to the cording or you've sewn too far away from the cording and you see too much of the tape portion of your piping, flip your flap so that it's wrong side facing out, and you can undo some stitches or make some adjustments and sew closer to the cording if necessary. Now, since I'm happy with the way that my piping looks, I'm just going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance, mostly around the rounded corners. And then I'm going to turn the flap right side out again and press it, and then I can top stitch my seam allowance. And my flap is done.